Hello and welcome to our first Smart Building webinar of 2020. I hope everyone is doing well and has had a good start to the year. And today, the big topic is 2020, the year of building automation cybersecurity. Very timely, I think, and very, very happy to have some real industry veterans on the line. We've got Anto Budiardjo, Jim Lee, and also a new contact of mine, Steve, and I'm going to ask all three of them to give a quick intro in a bit. What we are discussing today, basically these guys, we're live from AHR Expo, and we really wanted to have a good discussion around what this year might bring in terms of cybersecurity. So this is an overview of some of the things that they've already been discussing at AHR, and also around BACnet Secure Connect and other issues as well, which we will come on to shortly. Just before we start, I'm very interested in making this interactive. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to type them in. I'll be able to get them here and we'll then discuss those as we go along. And we've left time at the end as well to do that. Also, if you would like to subscribe to our content, please do. You can do that through SoundCloud, through iTunes, and through Spotify as well. You just need to search for Smart Building Series and you'll find us. And you'll be able to get this recording and you'll be able to listen to it as a podcast or even through YouTube. So there we go. That's the bit of housekeeping done. Now over to you guys. Anto, would you like to take over and make the introductions?
Yeah, it's great to talk to everybody from sunny Orlando. Although today wasn't so sunny, a little bit of cloudy, which is okay. So my name is Anto Budiardjo. I've been in the building automation, building systems space for about 30 years. A lot of the projects that I'm involved with right now revolve around cybersecurity, one way or another. I am the organizer of the New Deal's Cybersecurity Summit that we'll talk about in a short while. So that's obviously heavily revolving around security. I help Jim Lee on a new product technology called Secured by Cimetrics, and I also have another company, Paddy, which is creating a cloud-based platform that's also cybersecurity related. So cybersecurity is in a lot of things that I do, and I think obviously with both Jim and Steve. So Steve, do you want to go next and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Good morning, I'm Steve Fey, and I'm CEO of Totem Building Cyber Security. We're a new company, we've been in business now for a little over a year, and Totem is bringing a software platform that the industry can use to assess and manage cybersecurity risk. Some of you may know of me. I was CEO of Tritium from 2006 to 2012, and I've had stints at other building automation companies prior to that. And I'm glad to be part of this because cybersecurity is what we are all about, and hope to let you know more about it in the days and weeks to come.
Jim?
I am Jim Lee. I'm president of Cimetrics. Cimetrics now been in the business 30 years, and we are the largest supplier of BACnet technology to the controls industry. So we sell protocol stacks. We also have an analytics business. We've been very interested in cybersecurity for 10 to 15 years, and we've been working under the auspices of the ASHRAE BACnet Committee, specifically the IT working group, which is chaired by our CTO, Jim Butler. And in that group, we worked on developing BACnet Secure Connect, which was just released in November. So looking forward to an active discussion this morning of what BACnet Secure Connect is, what it is not, and what we really need to do to get security into this industry as quickly as possible.
Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is the Cybersecurity Summit that we held yesterday morning here in Orlando. It's been organized by an entity called New Deal for Buildings, which is sort of a loose organization with a mission of discussing key subjects that is sort of highly relevant to the building automation and smart building industry. And for last year, we did a summit in the AHR in Atlanta, and this year we did it here in Orlando. Those are the sponsors that gives an idea of who's sort of behind not only the summit, but also having a discussion about cybersecurity and how the BAS industry really needs to get its act together in this respect, dealing with cybersecurity, because it's going to be a real barrier to the adoption of all the sort of IP-centric and internet-centric smart building technology if we don't figure out cybersecurity. Right. So that was kind of the objective, certainly, of the summit this year. The speakers that we had on the panel, and many of them made presentations about various things that we'll come to in a minute. Again, it's an awesome lineup of really the thought leaders from the companies that sponsor the event on cybersecurity. So it was really good conversation. Do you want to talk a little bit about the?
I think that the interesting thing is that there's been quite an awakening. Last year, people were very interested in the security topic. Now they're really engaged in actionable items, trying to figure out their product management strategies on the OEM side, and building owners are trying to figure out what it means to their organizations, because security is a very large and open question, and a lot of people don't know where to start. So I think I'll turn it over to Steve for a minute. He can give perspectives on how to start and what he felt about the summit.
Thanks, Tim. So yeah, the challenge with cyber is it's multifaceted, and it affects the entire chain, if you will, of the parties that make up a building. So it starts with the owner. It starts with it moves into the facilities organization, and you have the manufacturers who provide the various systems. Where cyber is concerned, that has to go beyond building automation. These include lighting control and access and video surveillance and all of the systems that are intelligent and are in buildings, and typically today are networked. And then probably most importantly, it needs to involve the contractors who provide, install, and service these systems. And they all have a role to play in cyber. But at a very fundamental level, our industry is literally at the beginning of this journey. They're really waking up to the fact that these systems are getting hacked more and more increasingly, and there's just a fundamental issue about who owns the problem. And I think a simple answer to that is we all do. We all have a part to play, but there's this path to figuring out how to secure buildings effectively is one that we're very much in the question of right now, and that's one of the reasons we had this summit yesterday, was to get everybody talking about it and increase our collective awareness.
So because this is such a big subject that impacts a lot of people, we kind of need a framework or sort of a way to think about this. And we discussed this in the run up to the summit. We had quite a number of sort of planning calls with basically this group of people. And what we decided to do was to go all in on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is this thing here. Now, at first glance, it may kind of look dry and kind of not really that exciting, but it really draws the picture and tells the story of cybersecurity, right? Because cybersecurity is not just having a secure password and having BACnet SC. It involves all of these functions. So maybe we could spend a minute or two on each of these functions, sort of a summary of what happened yesterday. that will start to give, I think, the audience here sort of an idea of why this is important. So, Steve, you talked about identify yesterday, so you can do a summary version of that.
Absolutely. So, if you're not familiar with NIST and the cybersecurity framework, it's easy enough to go on, Google and look it up. It was developed initially, for sure, for the enterprise IT space, but all of the way the document works, the framework works, it's very much applicable to this controls industry in terms of how we need to think about cyber. It's a 5-step process, as you see here, and it begins on the left with identify. And identify really is about asking the question, do I know what I have in my building? And breaking that down, and do I know my environment? So the point about asset management is, what are my systems? I have BAS, I have lighting, I have access control, and so on. And my business environment is about answering the question, well, what kind of a building do I have? And what goes on in that building? Is this a hospital? Is this a data center? Is this an office building? Is this a retail outlet? And that's very important contextually in terms of cyber, because clearly, if I'm a hospital and I've got an operating suite, I don't want my HVAC going off in the middle of surgery. So the criticality is really the question you need to ask yourself when you're talking about the business environment. Governance touches on the topic of policies and procedures. Jim Lee was very insightful yesterday in his presentation, and he said, we're an industry that sells products and projects, and we don't really get involved too much with process. And governance is really all about process, and specific to security, it's such a major piece that we're really uncomfortable with, and we've got to take seriously. When you start to run the process of cybersecurity, you're doing an assessment, meaning you're going in and deciding, what are my assets, what is my business environment, do I have the policies I need, and if not, I need to create them. So that's what you undertake to begin this journey of securing your systems. First, have to assess them. Once they're assessed, then you need to have a strategy for how you're going to maintain your security over time, and that's really what risk management is about. Because I'm sure you all know, the bar for securing systems in the IT world has to grow every year, and it's going to be no different for us. Every year the systems change, the threat, what they call the threat vectors, increase. So you have to have a strategy that's going to take that into account. A strategy around how you're going to respond to threats when they occur. And then finally, you have the supply chain. And in this industry, I would say supply chain is a critical factor, and it's about the relationship of the owner to the various vendors as represented by manufacturers and the contractors themselves. And one of the things that's certainly not in place today in that regard is when you look at a building automation specification, for example, it's very operationally driven or functionally driven. There isn't a section in the specification that talks about cyber. That's going to change. Contracts between owners and contractors are going to have requirements for those organizations to be operating in a way that is secure. And so you're going to see a lot of changes in this particular bucket, and it's, again, all part of identifying.
Jim, can you talk about protect and detect?
Absolutely, absolutely. First, I'd like to start out and say, look at everything that Steve just went over. How much technology is involved in that? Certainly some, but the real story here is that the NIST framework is a way of thinking about problems, but they're not just technology problems. There's a lot of business process here. In fact, almost all of it is business process. I am going to talk about the technology sections now in protect and detect, but I just want to make clear that this isn't, once again, a product or a project which is going to deploy a technology to solve this problem. It's largely a process problem. But on to protect for a minute. So how do we protect these systems? First, we have to decide under identity management and access control who's going to be allowed to get on the systems. And there are many ways of controlling that. Certainly, we're all familiar with passwords and other things, but it's a much more complex topic. Awareness and training. How do we get the building automation industry, the users, the owners, the building operators to have awareness of security and what it takes to actually deploy these systems? Now we finally get to some technology, data security. This is where BACnet Secure Connect would come in, actually physically securing the networks that are out there. Information protection, once again, processes and procedures. How do I handle the information? Not just the bits on the wire on the network, but documentation as to how the systems are built. Maintenance. Once the system goes in, once again, we have hackers continually trying to get into these systems over time. So you don't just buy security and it goes away. You have to continue to work on it over time. And this includes things like software updates. As you know, there are security patches coming into your devices all the time. But how are we going to get into these deeply embedded devices? These are some of the kinds of things that technology is going to change with. And we'll talk about BACnet SC. It's secured by Cimetrics. Some of these technologies that we're using to provide that ongoing maintenance. And finally, protective technology. Once again, we're down into the protocol stacks and the real bits and bytes of how we do the security, which we'll talk more about later. Okay, so that's how you basically secure the system. What happens if someone gets in anyways? How do you detect hackers, problems, anomalies, and events? And the answer is that you have to have software and processes to understand what normal behavior is and be able to detect abnormal behavior. You have to monitor the system basically permanently to make sure that people aren't trying to get in. Then you have to have business process as to how that detection works. Anto?
So the two right-hand columns, respond and recover, are very much process and business oriented, right? A lot of it's about, in both, it's about planning. So obviously you need to plan how you would respond when an incident occurs in a building. So that's a key part of respond, the sort of the respond function. Part of that planning we'll talk about, it needs to be about communications. And here we're not really talking about network communications, we're talking about human communication. You know, what to say to your tenants, what to say to your vendors, who to say that to, etc., etc. And also, depending on the building, if it's a large or a prominent building, it's communication through the media. And then there's analysis of what's going on, so you can actually react properly. Mitigation and improvements are sort of self-improvement sort of cycles after a response incident, and mitigate the incident from happening again. So one of the interesting things about the respond, when you start to talk about respond, is that that's quite likely to happen, you know, probably years after the building is installed. Right? It may happen the next day, but it could also happen more likely in years down the road. And the question is, by that time, any installer or contractor that's involved in the installation of BAS would have been long gone. Right? They would be on other projects. They may be in the maintenance loop, but they may not be. Right? So what's interesting is that what the condition, right, can actually impact the response down the road when they're no longer involved. Right? So one of the questions I suppose is that, you know, how does that work? How when an incident happen and there's all this sort of panic stations trying to figure out what's going on. Hopefully not so much panic, but what is the impact on that contractor that probably hasn't thought about that building for years? And one of the really striking answer is that yes, it does impact that contractor, because the sort of the reputation of that contractor could actually be brought out into as part of the response process, or it may actually be something that was caused years ago that was not something that was not done right. So, this kind of thinking really is kind of is brought out by this whole sort of framework. The last function is recover, and this similar kind of things here, which is really how to recover. Planning wise, there was a lot of talk and discussion about tabletop exercises to actually sort of run through fire drill kind of scenarios of how to bring the system back online, how to make sure you have good backups. And again, there's a lot of communications, both internally,
Lessons learned.
Lessons learned and improvement, the sort of the cycle. One of I think the thing that kept on coming up, and I think was probably the biggest takeaway from this whole discussion, was that there was in a lot of the answers and discussion, there was a lot of people saying, you need to make a plan, and you need to do this, and you need to do that. And then the question is like, who is you? When you say you, who is you? And there is no one you. I mean, ideally, it would be a really sort of organized building owner that can actually sort of take that role. But in a lot of cases, actually us, all the way from the vendors to the contractor, integrated facility management, and the building sort of management. So that's kind of the biggest sort of takeaway that I got. And you're not immune just because you're doing a project and you're out and you finish the project. So that's kind of my take on what happened. Hand it over back to you, Jim. Are there any questions?
Thanks.
Do you have any comments?
Yes, Anto. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions here. One, from a European perspective, did you guys take into account or align with some of the legislation that's coming out of the EU, like the Cybersecurity Act?
Yes, it did. It did come up. Hans Jorg was our European representative. Where did it come up? Just trying to think.
There was a little bit of discussion around GDPR.
Yes.
But is there are you saying, Jim, that there's a separate standard that's coming out of Europe that's similar to NIST? Is that what you're talking about?
It was a question was raised by one of the audience, and I know that there's recently been some EU legislation passed called the Cybersecurity Act, and I think the question was whether what NIST is talking about here, or in the discussion that you guys had, did it come up, and is there some alignment with some of that legislation?
So I don't think either of the three of us know specifics about that.
No problem.
But I think the answer has to be yes. We talked about GDPR. We also talked a little bit about the California initiative, the cybersecurity and IoT initiative, and that it definitely has to fit into this. It may be a good subject that we need to sort of cover the next one, but we didn't. There wasn't that deep conversation about that.
No problem. And then another question here, saying, of course, that this cybersecurity frameworks are very helpful. Of course, this NIST one, and I think it's actually very well put together. I think this makes things very interesting. But their question is, how helpful would this be, or would it be well understood by installers? I mean, I guess that comes as part of under the identify umbrella, right? But I think it's a valid question. I mean, in terms of education, really, isn't it? Like, how do we expect this to be understood by every stakeholder? And if so, how do you think, how do we meet that challenge?
Yeah, I guess you're asking a question that's sort of in the wheelhouse of what Totem, this company that I'm running, is trying to help answer. So the reality is that at the contractor level, there's a strong lack of awareness, a significant lack of awareness around what cyber is, and so there's a tremendous educational challenge in front of us, and that's a big part of what Totem is trying to do for the contractors out there is give them a means to get them up this learning curve, because you throw a document like this up in front of them and they're not, you're going to get glazed eyes, to be honest. So you've got to take this and turn it into something that speaks their language in terms of whether it's building, automation or access control. It has to be very relevant to the things that they actually do. So what does that mean? Well, they configure systems, they configure the users in those systems, they install control networks, they configure and install servers in many cases, and they have, and hopefully they're organizing some sort of backup to these systems as well. Well, that's the language that where we have to take the theory, if you will, here and put it into practice, because the objective is to get them to understand the right ways to do these configurations and these setups such that they're done to align well with the principles here that the framework talks about. So yeah, it's an educational challenge. It's one that's going to take, frankly, years to.
Yep. And actually, there's some comments here as well along those lines. One here, there is an educational process that integrators need to go through and mature the processes they use. And they need to start with basic best practices. Also here another comment. The responsibility is for sure us, in inverted commas, but would it be nobody at the end of the day if the roles and responsibilities are not clearly defined? So yeah, I think that echoes what you were saying.
Yeah, if I could sort of expand on that a little bit, right? So there was one part of the discussion yesterday which I thought was really interesting. It's like this whole sort of you, us, and who's actually doing what. So the question was, all of this would work fine if the building owner has a plan, right? I mean, they're, at the end of the day, they're probably the top of the food chain, right? So the question is, okay, so if you're a contractor and you're responding to a bid and you get the project, or you're likely to get the project, but there is no plan, right? But there needs to be a plan, because if there is no plan, that you may be at risk 3 years down the road when something happens. What should you as a contractor, as an installer, do, right? You're not going to turn away the job, because generally speaking, contractors don't do that. Don't want to do that. Thank you very much. So there's an opportunity there for people who install buildings to say, hey, building owner, or hey, whoever it is that they're dealing with, there really should be a plan here, and this is kind of our template of a plan. We'd like to see something like this, so that everybody's protected and doing the responsible thing. So there are opportunities, and I think one of the slides that Jim Lee had really speaks to the fact that there's a lot of opportunities for stakeholders in the sort of the building automation chain, as it were, to actually promote the fact that cybersecurity has to be thought out throughout the process, and not just a simple technology issue.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. I think ultimately this will become a big opportunity for people as well to differentiate their offering, about how much security they can provide. Yeah, just one more comment I've had in before we move on. I know we're keen to talk about BACnet SC as well. The building owner has been heavily dependent on the systems integrator. Therefore, the SI is the primary knowledge keeper. The building owner needs to take over more of the knowledge keeper role. I think, yeah, interesting comment.
Yeah, for sure. Anto was referring to the who owns this thing, and what's the head of the top of the pyramid, and really it needs to be the owner ultimately. But in facilities organizations, Again, there's a lack of awareness of cybersecurity as part of the responsibility for the facilities team. Generally, when there's a problem, it ends up in the IT. Larger organizations may often bring IT into the picture, or larger facility organizations sometimes have a dedicated IT resource on the team. And that's really critical at the end of the day, that the owner assume the overall responsibility for security, particularly when you get into respond and recover and think about what happens when an event occurs. It's got to be driven at the owner level as to who's going to be on the hook for figuring out the problem, for mitigating the damage while things are going on. And again, if you haven't thought through what your policies and procedures are going to look like when that event occurs, you're going to be caught unprepared, and no one's going to look good in that process. So we very much encourage that the owners assume the overall, or be the accountable party in this effort.
And to that end, we had quite a discussion yesterday about who's going to pay and what it means. And when we talk about the building owner, if you look at larger organizations, as security is a process, not a project or a product, it can't be financed the way that we build buildings, where everything's contemplated as a capital asset up front, and then not another penny is spent over the life cycle. Because it's ongoing, and because IT changes at 3-year intervals and buildings at 30-year intervals, the question is who has the budget to actually pay for ongoing security? And largely there's a thought process that leads to IT will pay that ongoing component. But we haven't made that leap to hyperspace where IT actually has budgets right now. So this is going to be a very interesting thing in the industry to see how it shakes out. The question as to who is going to pay.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Would you like to move on now to the next slide?
Yeah. So just a quick point before we move on. The speakers that made these presentations yesterday wrote a series of articles that are on the New Deal blog. It's actually, they're relatively short, 4 or 5 minute pieces each. It would be really interesting reading for your audience. Right. And we're also working on combining them into essentially a white paper that we'll distribute sometime in the next week or two. And I'll notify you, Jim, so that maybe you can distribute that to your subscribers.
We can put some links up on the notes for this webinar, definitely.
All right. So moving on, the next subject is BACnet SC. Jim, do you want to start this?
Sure. So once again, BACnet SC has been developed under the auspices of the ASHRAE BACnet Committee, the IT working group. Work commenced on it over 10 years ago, and it was approved finally as an ASHRAE standard as part of the BACnet standard in November. BACnet SC, if you will, is a secure data link layer. So BACnet has many other data link layers today, including BACnet IP, which is very prevalent, MSTP, etc. So you can think of BACnet Secure Connect as just a new data link layer. Overall is to make BACnet IT friendly. And this was the idea from the very beginning. The idea is that, once again, buildings are on 10, 20, 30-year time cycles, and building automation as well, whereas IT is on a 3-year time horizon. So anything we do in building automation and apply could be wildly obsolete even before it hits the market, just because of the fast rate of change of IT standards and processes. So the idea was to split the two things and abstract away the very valuable pieces of BACnet for our industry, like the application layers and data definitions, and subtract that away from whatever the IT technology du jour is. So right now, BACnet SC is a series of BACnet applications and data definitions, regular BACnet, and it runs over basically WebSockets, which is the same technology you would use if you were browsing your secure web browser to your bank website. So imagine that as the underlying technology, and that uses something called TLS 1.3, and it's a very secure technology. Going on a little bit, there are some other changes that are needed because, yes, it is just another data link layer, but now we have to handle security certificates. We have to handle assigning those certificates, configuring the systems. And there's a traffic cop that we've added, and that's called the hub. The BACnet SC hub organizes and sets up the communication with the devices. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the diagram, I can have peer-to-peer communication once that security is established. We also have a failover hub where that primary hub to become to fail. So that gives us some reliability. Anto, you want to make some comments, and I'll go on to that.
Yeah, so that's BACnet SC. It's a new transport layer which is secure, which is great. The challenge is that when you think about security in the sort of the big picture, everything that needs to be secured, it's not just the communication between devices that needs to be secured. It's actually the whole system needs to be secured, right? And that BACnet SC brings with it some challenges, right? Because to enable TLS, each BACnet SC device needs a digital certificate, right? Digital certificates are things that are typically installed in servers in the internet that we use daily on a bank server, for example, and other commerce servers, and so they're not trivial things to install, right? And all of a sudden we're in this sort of situation where every single VAV needs a digital certificate, right? Just mull upon that statement for a bit, and that's not trivial, right? So that's a challenge. So it does not secure the whole network, meaning that we know that people are not going to just sort of rip out all of the old BACnet and all of the non-BACnet stuff that's in a building once BACnet SC products come to the market. So we actually have to think about securing the whole network, right? And the sort of the third big point is that the consumers of the security information about a building, where when an incident happened, the response and everything else, is they now have the responsibility of managing cybersecurity in buildings, which is regarded quite rightly as sort of key assets to enterprises, right? So BACnet SC doesn't do anything to help that other than knowing that the devices are on a secure layer. So some other tools are necessary to deliver stuff to the IT organization, right? And then this also, you start to think about the NIST framework that we talked about earlier, and all the other sort of process stuff that needs to happen. Everything from the identify and risk assessment all the way to planning. None of that is handled in BACnet SC. So I mean, that's kind of the situation. That's kind of the nutshell. And it's a great. We've made great progress with this, but we've only just started. We're just
absolutely. And let's just look at some of the implications here. What happens when the facilities guy needs to change a variable air volume box? He needs a security certificate to even change a box. So if you have a large building, you suddenly have automation that's necessary to automate that process, lest the facility guy have to go to the IT department to get a security certificate to type into every box every time it needs work.
So if you take the sort of the bigger picture, from an IT perspective, the sort of the architecture that you need to be looking at is kind of more like this, right? You have the green, which is the sort of the more traditional IT devices and switches and services that the IT department is runs or operates on a daily basis. This is a highly simplified diagram, so there's additional products and routers and stuff that's not depicted here. So all the green stuff is what IT know and love, right? So the blue boxes are the BACnet SC devices that can now technically be on that same network because they are secure, right? In reality, there probably won't be. There'll probably some kind of VLANing sort of mechanism, but there is no reason why this can't occur because it's secure. So you then have these on the left here, what the Cimetrics call an SBC appliance, which is Cimetrics implementation of the BACnet hub, in addition to additional management functions that are needed to manage the BACnet SC devices. You know, how to onboard, how to manage certificates, how to do things like backup and restore, how to authenticate devices, how to authorize them, etc., etc. Right. So now that the devices are secure, the BACnet, the end devices are secure. You actually need a management layer to sit above it to actually manage all of those things. And the stack that is Cimetrics is actually launching here at AHR, that's called Secured by Cimetrics, is that stack that provides the management layer at the appliance, at the failover appliance, and also all the way up to the SBC cloud, which is the sort of remote management sort of view of multiple buildings. The other component of this is there are a whole bunch of BACnet IP and MSTP devices that's not going to be ripped out. Right, so we see that at the bottom on the left and on the right, and so there will be needed BACnet routers and firewalls that will isolate those inherently insecure devices so that they can be brought into the secure side of the network. So this is kind of really what the new architecture needs to look like, and this is also, if you look at it from an IT perspective, an IT organization, this is more akin to what they normally see. Do you have any comments on this, Steve?
Yeah, just curious about the BACnet router specifically to the old IP devices, MSTP devices. How does that play into the architecture?
Well, basically, you need a series of firewall rules that will keep bad actors, if they were to get into the unprotected side, the traditional BACnet IP side, from having any effect on the BACnet Secure Connect side. So that's what we're looking at. And depending on those applications, those firewalls may need different rule sets. I think it might be a good time to pause for some questions. We just covered an awful lot of ground. We can certainly go into much more depth, but it'd be interesting to see if people have any questions on what we've talked about so far.
Yes, why not? Let's do that. So anyone out there got some questions about the last couple of slides we've seen, feel free to put them in. One here is a comment, and I think it goes back to a little bit about what we were talking about earlier, but sometimes IT is the cause of operational negative impact due to lack of understanding. I think that's a fair comment. There needs to be a cooperative effort between FM and IT to avoid this. And NIST acknowledged with 8228 that OT cannot be managed with IT processes. Also, a question here.
Jim, I can share a story with you for a major building in a major city here in the United States.
Please do, yeah.
Where they had about the IT department was scanning using conventional scanning tools, and they shut down about 6,000 of the 10,000 devices by simply, trying to find port vulnerabilities on the devices. So the comment from the audience is absolutely correct, that cybersecurity in the world of control systems has to be looked at and understood and managed differently than you manage conventional IT devices.
And what's your sense?
No, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, what's your sense then of where we are with that? Is there still, is there now a good understanding of that, or is that still like a major issue?
I think not. I think it's still evolutionary. You know, if you turn back the clock 20 years, the problem was that the building automation industry was very uninformed about IT. And now I think we've gotten to the point where there are a lot of very sophisticated people in the building automation space. And in fact, we often don't even get the chance to have an audience with the right people at IT. And when the answer is no out of the chute, without being able to have a rational conversation, it makes it difficult to move forward. We do think that will change and break down, but it does amaze me every day the number of IT people that basically have no idea about the operational technology world.
So I think the other sort of big thing to take away from this is that IT people are never going to want to understand or need to understand the sort of the inner workings of BAS systems, right? And the chances of IT organizations and IT people being up on something like BACnet, if you go to an IT department and you say there's BACnet being installed, it's not going to resonate at all. It doesn't make sense, and it's not likely to make sense, right? I mean, there are obviously some IT people that do, and that's great. So I think the philosophy needs to be that we, as the BAS industry, need to adopt how BAS systems are being seen by IT people, right? And that's not too difficult because they have pretty set standards and pretty set tools that they use, whether they're managing servers within their data centers or PCs around their network or printers. All of that is known, and we need to make sure that both the information and the presentment of the network architecture fits with their model of things, right? Then we can do stuff underneath that. And this is the purpose of this particular slide. It was done, with a mind to actually present this to IT. They would understand that, but they would probably not understand the previous slide about BACnet SC because it really didn't make any sense. Right.
One of the things we're trying to do to address that is not only as vendors, we're trying to create products that deliver the kinds of things that traditional IT departments would like to see. So when we're providing monitoring services to these new BACnet networks through secured by Cimetrics, for instance, we're serving up things like syslogs and events in such a way as that the traditional IT tools like SIEM tools can look at that information and use it in a way that that's one method. The other thing we're trying to do is after we standardize some of these new features, which will go on top of BACnet SC, we're hoping to standardize them through some IT standards organizations as well, such as the IETF or OASIS, rather than just ASHRAE, so we can come to the IT community with something they're more comfortable with.
I think it's a good time to go to the next slide, which is actually our last slide. That actually, because the question here is with SC and the sort of this new architecture that we need to go to, how do we make this happen, and how do we make this happen, soon rather than in 10 years, right? So there are two initiatives that were launched this week at AHR that sort of is all about not business for you as usual, right? And Jim, you want to talk about these?
So in terms of figuring out how we can accelerate adoption, Andy McMillan and BACnet International have launched a rapid implementation program where they're creating a Java-based reference code as well as test devices to help speed manufacturers and OEMs along their way. And they're also looking at accelerating the testing at the BACnet testing laboratories for BACnet Secure Connect compliant products. And at Cimetrics, we're looking much more broadly than BACnet SC at some of these other functions which are completely necessary to have actually a functioning security solution in the industry. So things such as onboarding, device certification management, interoperable configuration, secure backup and restore, firmware update. To do that, we're banding together a consortium of large OEMs in the industry to come up with these new standards collectively. And in about a year's time, those standards are going to be reintroduced into the BACnet committee, as well as some of these organizations like the IETF, to secure other functions that are beyond just the data link. So we apologize for the background music. The show carnival seems to be starting up here a little bit.
Yeah, live from AHR. It's about to open in 10 minutes. But we should be able to continue for another 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Any questions?
Good. Yeah, there's a question/comment here. Be interested to get your take on this. Someone's saying, in my experience, IT groups can have a difficult time giving remote access to BAS service providers. Do you feel that utilizing outbound ports for monitoring only would be a way past this? The ability to command remotely would be lost, but at the very least, you could view your equipment and properly deploy when needed.
Yes, the architecture, if I go back to the architecture diagram, and not just for Secured by Cimetrics, there are a number of other companies marketing security VPN type products. And the architecture, the sort of the going forward architecture is really a device from inside calling out, calling home, right? So the way it works with Secured by Cimetrics is the appliance that you see on the left there actually initiates everything from inside the organization out to the cloud when it needs to provide remote management of the devices, right? So other products from companies like Tossybox and Separate Networks and IoT do the same thing or something similar. Obviously not specific to BACnet. So that actually solves a lot of problems because no ports actually need to be opened up. They typically go from inside out, and they are typically obviously security devices, inherently secure, like Secured by Cimetrics and the other products that I mentioned. And IT departments and other systems in the IT organization would behave the same way. I think a lot of things like printers do the same thing. They call out. So this is again something that's familiar to IT organizations.
Good. Okay.
I think I would add to that.
Sorry.
That, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It really depends on the organization, what the mission is. Some places will allow no outbound service, but I think that the methods that Anto mentioned are usually acceptable to most people when they understand them.
Mm-hmm. Got some more questions coming. We'll try and answer all these before we finish. Yeah, interesting one, this. I would be interested to hear from the panel as to what is the best way to get started. It sounds like you start with identify from the NIST framework, but tactically, what do you actually do in existing buildings?
So from an assessment perspective, the first thing is we're talking about a single system, like building automation. Then the assessment process is to look at the key elements that make it up. So in the case of a building automation system, you typically have a server and you have some IP controllers, and it's at the IP level that you're most concerned. So at the server level, what is it we're concerned about? Well, what's the software revision on the server itself, both on the application and at the operating system level? Are they up to date? Yes or no? If they are, do they have the latest security patches in them? So that's typically the key starting point. Then the server and/or the network type controllers often have user configurations within the panel or within the server, and the configurations thing you're going to look at because for an example of that is many systems have some sort of auto lockout feature that the application supports. has that been used? Because that's critical to defeating any kind of password cracker that might be trying to guess the passwords to the system. So that's a typical step. You know, we've talked a little bit about, referred just a few minutes ago about the network side. So the system is connected often remotely, and ability. And if you're not using some kind of a secure VPN product, you need to be, because the system can be, particularly systems that have public-facing IP addresses, can be discovered easily. And there's websites you can go to, like Shodan, that have lists of all the public-facing IP systems in the marketplace today. You don't want to be one of them. So those are just a couple of examples of typical areas where you start to break down the process of doing your assessment.
I would actually provide a different answer. Not, you know, everything Steve said is valid, but I think the first thing you need to do, especially if you're sort of in the channel integrator or contractor, is to raise the cybersecurity issue, right? You are likely to be in meetings with clients, with vendors, with your project team, you know, planning things, planning a project, planning, you know, even a sales process. I believe that in each and every one of those meetings, where you have a sort of a listed agenda of stuff to, you know, products to decide, whatever, there needs to be a line item that says cybersecurity. You know, how in this particular context of this project being executed, what are the cybersecurity implications? Is the building owner aware of the need for a plan for, you know, the restore and recovery and all this stuff? So you really need to. It's as we talked about earlier in the summit discussion, it's more about the process and sort of the human sort of side of things. And I think you need to bring that up even before you start to talk about technology and you know, the stuff that we're talking about here. Bring it up every time, and if there's no good answer, you know, you really need to push that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some good advice there. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, guys. Here it is. Do you think that an IT web services approach such as MQTT with certificate authentication will be the only approach that IT departments will accept?
I don't. The BACnet committee has looked at MQTT, and it might be an option that they go with in the future, but we don't believe that will be the only option. There are some people that are biased towards that solution, but there are many other solutions out there. For people who are generally not experienced with what's gone on in the industry for the last 30 years, it looked like an attractive option. But a lot of people coming in from the IT side or the IoT side really don't have the perspective of just how deeply embedded the industry is with existing technologies. And MQTT does not add a significant amount of value. It's fine technology and could be used, but it's certainly not an imperative.
Okay.
I would
just
it kind of depends on which part of the stack you're talking about, right? So maybe in the sort of the IT communications, the communications to the cloud and things that are sort of towards the top of the stack, something like MQTT would be more applicable. But Jim's comments about something like BACnet and other sort of building-centric protocols have much more sort of nuance to the applications that we have to deal with.
Yeah. In fact, I'd point out that the real value of something like BACnet is the application layer, data definitions, default behaviors, how information is represented. How it's transmitted on the wire is a commodity, and whatever that communication technology is will certainly evolve over time. And ultimately, we're agnostic on that.
I think if I was to read into the question a little bit, I was wondering if what they were saying was because MQTT with certificate authentication is something that IT departments know about, quote unquote. is, are they more comfortable with it, and therefore is it something, because they understand it a little bit more, they're more inclined to go with it? Is there something in that?
Well, I mean, it's part of the sort of the thesis that I mentioned earlier, that we obviously need to apply as much IT friendly technologies as possible, right? So the statement that you made fits with that, but we also have to make sure that the applications of controlling air and heat and all the stuff that BAS does works the way it has to work. Otherwise, you really don't have an automation system. So it has to sort of balance the two. In some places you can and should do that, but in other places you can't. So it's kind of, there's a lot of pieces to this, and I don't think making a blanket statement like MQTT is the only thing just doesn't make sense. It's the same saying that BACnet is the only thing. That doesn't make sense either.
No, for sure. And I don't think
I would go further. Subtle reasons that it's not as straightforward as it appears.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I don't think that who asked the question, they were saying that it was the only the only way forward. Just that, I think it was, as you said, Anto, kind of fits into what you were saying about being able to talk the same language, or at least consider IT departments and things like that. I think looks like we've come to an end. I'm afraid we've run out of time. There are some questions I wasn't able to get to, so I'm sorry for that. But feel free maybe to post them on our website once I put the video up, and we'll try and get around to answering them when we can. I think just remains me to say, guys, from your perspective, was there anything you wanted to finish with?
I think just thank you everyone in the audience for listening. This is a very dynamic topic and will be changing very rapidly over the next few years. We're taking the first steps now to get started, but we certainly appreciate everyone's feedback and questions, and look forward to working with you as an industry as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Good.
Great.
And we have recorded the session, so I'll be putting up the slides and the audio recording on our website, memory.com, later, so you'll be able to listen again, or of course please feel free to share with colleagues or other industry contacts and spread the word. And beyond that, you can also subscribe to all of our content. All the webinars we'll be doing this year, that's going to be up on iTunes and Spotify. So if you search for Smart Building Series, you'll find us there. And thanks again for you listening today. Appreciate it. And of course to Anto, Steve, Jim, thanks very much for your time.
Jim, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.